11 days. That's all it took for the Soviet Union to wipe an entire Japanese army off the map. Nearly 1 million soldiers crushed with a kill ratio approaching 30-1. Soviet forces advanced faster than in any campaign they'd fought in Europe, and they did it while settling a blood debt that had festered for 4 decades. This was Operation August Storm, and its impact on World War II remains underestimated to this day. The roots of this campaign stretch back not to 1945, but 40 years earlier, to a wound so deep it survived revolution, civil war, and the complete transformation of Russian society. It was a humiliation that burned in the national memory, waiting for the moment it could be erased forever. And when that moment arrived, the Soviets would unleash a form of warfare so overwhelming that an entire army would simply cease to exist. Some nations forget their defeats. Russia never forgot 1905, and it cut deeper than any military humiliation in Russian history. The Russo-Japanese War began without warning on the night of February 8, 1904, when Japanese torpedo boats struck the Russian fleet at Port Arthur. What followed was a series of catastrophes that shook the Russian Empire to its foundations. At Mukden in February and March of 1905, over 300,000 Russian soldiers clashed with Japanese forces in the largest land battle the world had ever witnessed. Both armies lost roughly a third of their strength, but the Japanese drove the Russians from the field. Mukden fell. The defeat was absolute. Then came Tsushima. Russia's Baltic fleet had sailed 18,000 nautical miles around the globe to relieve Port Arthur. On May 27, 1905, the Japanese intercepted them in the straits between Korea and Japan. What followed wasn't a battle, it was an annihilation. The Japanese sank or captured virtually the entire Russian fleet. Thousands of Russian sailors perished. Japanese losses were negligible. It was the most complete naval victory since Trafalgar. The Treaty of Portsmouth in September of 1905 made Russia's defeat official. Japan seized Port Arthur, the Liaodong Peninsula, and the southern half of Sakhalin Island. Russia acknowledged Japanese dominance in Korea and withdrew from Manchuria. For the first time in modern history, an Asian power had crushed a European empire in a major war. The trauma extended beyond military defeat. Inside Russia, the disaster sparked the revolution of 1905. Tsar Nicholas II was forced to grant constitutional reforms he never meant to honor. Intensity went medium. The humiliation became embedded in Russian national identity, and it survived the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. The new Soviet state inherited the wound, and Soviet leaders never let it fade. Soviet military thinking developed in the shadow of 1905. The Red Army's obsession with modernization, mechanized warfare, and what they called deep operations reflected a determination to never again suffer from the incompetence, poor leadership, and technological backwardness that had destroyed the Tsarist forces. Soviet commanders studied the failures at Mukden and Tsushima the way surgeons dissect fatal mistakes. They wouldn't make them again. When Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky designed Operation August Storm in 1945, he made the vengeance explicit. Soviet propaganda and military directives openly reference settling accounts for 1905. The recapture of Port Arthur received special emphasis despite its limited tactical importance. Soviet troops would deliberately plant the red banner over the fortress where Russian defeat had begun 40 years before. The symbolic reversal of Tsushima mattered as much as any military objective. This wasn't simply a campaign, it was the erasure of national disgrace. But revenge requires an enemy worth destroying. And by August of 1945, the once fearsome Kwantung Army that had terrorized Asia was no longer what it appeared to be. The Kwantung Army's fearsome reputation was built on brutality and conquest, but reputations can outlive reality. By the summer of 1945, the force Tokyo still called its elite Continental Army was a hollow shell wearing the uniform of its former glory. The Kwantung Army had begun as a garrison force, protecting Japanese interests around Port Arthur after the Russo-Japanese War. By the 1930s, it had transformed into Japan's primary weapon of imperial expansion on the Asian mainland. In 1931, Kwantung officers staged the Mukden incident, manufacturing a pretext for the full invasion and occupation of Manchuria. They created the puppet state of Manchukuo and operated with remarkable independence, frequently acting without authorization from Tokyo. At its peak, the Kwantung Army numbered over 700,000 men and included Japan's finest infantry, armor, and cavalry formations. But that was before the Pacific War consumed everything. As American forces island-hopped toward the Japanese home islands, Tokyo stripped the Kwantung Army of its best divisions, its equipment, and its veteran personnel. Elite formations were redeployed to desperate last stands in the Philippines, Okinawa, and the home islands. What remained, in Manchuria by August of 1945, was a hollow facade. The numbers revealed the decay. Of 25 divisions, only 6 were rated combat effective. The remainder consisted of undertrained conscripts, aging reservists, and rear echelon support troops. Many formations existed only in paperwork. The army's official strength stood at 700,000, but only around 600,000 were actually present, and most of them were poorly trained and inadequately equipped. The equipment gap was staggering. The Kwantung Army fielded roughly 1,155 tanks, but most were obsolete Type 97 Chiha and Type 95 Hago light tanks with inadequate armor and feeble guns. They stood no chance against modern Soviet armor. The Japanese possessed about 6,700 artillery pieces, but ammunition was critically short. Their air force numbered approximately 1,800 aircraft, but fuel shortages grounded most of them, and those that could fly were outdated designs facing modern Soviet fighters and ground attack planes. Japanese defensive doctrine remained frozen in World War I thinking. Despite intelligence awareness of Soviet mobile warfare capabilities, especially after the crushing defeat at Khalkhin Gol in 1939, the Kwantung Army's plans depended on fixed fortifications and linear defense. They'd constructed what they called the Manchurian Wall, a network of bunkers, pillboxes, and defensive positions designed to halt frontal attacks. Many of these works were incomplete or poorly maintained. The doctrine emphasized holding terrain rather than flexible defense. There were no strategic reserves and no mobile units capable of counterattacking Soviet breakthroughs. The army was imprisoned by its own limitations. Senior Kwantung officers understood they faced a superior enemy. They'd witnessed what happened at Khalkhin Gol when General Zhukov's forces encircled and annihilated Japanese units using combined arms and deep penetration tactics. But knowing and adapting were different things. The Kwantung Army lacked the tanks, trucks, fuel, and training to implement mobile defense. They were condemned to prepare for a war they knew they couldn't win using tactics they knew were outdated. Morale was brittle. Soldiers understood Japan was losing the war. Cities were incinerating under American bombs. The Navy had been destroyed. Defeat loomed on the horizon. Yet they were expected to defend an endless frontier against an enemy whose true strength they could only imagine. Training was woefully inadequate. Many conscripts received only weeks of preparation before deployment to remote border outposts. Officers who'd survived China or the Pacific were rare. Most leaders were garrison troops who'd never experienced modern combat. Against this phantom army, the Soviets were about to unleash a form of warfare the Japanese had never witnessed and could never have survived. The Germans had taught the Soviets how to wage modern war through 4 years of carnage. Now, the Japanese would face the graduates. Operation August Storm represented the pinnacle of Soviet operational art, refined in the inferno of the Eastern Front. Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky commanded the entire operation, orchestrating 3 massive fronts in a campaign engineered to annihilate Japanese forces through simultaneous multi-axis attacks, deep penetration, and relentless operational tempo. The Soviet force was overwhelming. The Transbaikal Front under General Rodion Malinovsky deployed approximately 416,000 troops, 1,150 tanks, and self-propelled guns, 5,250 artillery pieces and mortars, as well as 1,400 aircraft. The First Far Eastern Front, under General Kirill Meretskov, fielded about 586,000 troops, 1,550 tanks, 7,400 artillery pieces, and 1,360 aircraft. The Second Far Eastern Front, under General Maxim Pukayev, added another 337,000 troops, 600 tanks, 4,200 artillery pieces, and 100 aircraft. In total, the Soviets massed approximately 1.66 million troops, between 3,000 and 5,500 tanks, and self-propelled guns depending on classification, around 17,000 artillery pieces and mortars, and roughly 3,700 aircraft. The disparity was devastating. Soviet armored forces outnumbered Japanese tanks by at least 4-1, and the quality gap was even more pronounced. Soviet T-34-85 medium tanks, IS-2 heavy tanks, and Su-76 and ISU-152 self-propelled guns were combat-proven weapons that had shattered the Wehrmacht. Japanese Type 97 and Type 95 tanks were thinly armored coffins armed with guns that could barely dent Soviet armor. In some sectors, Soviet artillery enjoyed a 4-1 superiority. Soviet air power was absolute. Roughly 3,700 modern aircraft, including Yak-9 fighters, La-5 and La-7 fighters, as well as Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack planes, faced approximately 800 obsolete Japanese planes, and most of those couldn't even get airborne due to fuel shortages. But numbers alone don't explain what happened. The Soviets had developed a doctrine called deep operations, glubokaya operatsiya, that transformed numerical advantage into operational annihilation. The concept was elegant, but devastatingly effective. Instead of attacking along a single axis and grinding through defenses layer by layer, Soviet forces would strike simultaneously across multiple axes, driving deep into enemy rear areas. Operational maneuver groups, fast-moving formations of tanks, and mechanized infantry would exploit every breakthrough and advance hundreds of kilometers beyond the front lines. They'd bypass strongpoints rather than reducing them, leaving isolated defenders to be eliminated by follow-on echelons. The objective wasn't pushing the enemy backward, it was encircling and destroying entire formations, shattering command and control, and preventing any organized response. The Transbaikal Front executed the deepest and most audacious thrust. Malinovsky's forces confronted what the Japanese believed was an impassable natural barrier, the Greater Khingan Mountain Range. The terrain was rugged and waterless, crossed by few roads. Japanese planners assumed no modern mechanized force could traverse it rapidly. They were catastrophically mistaken. Soviet engineers and tank crews had prepared with meticulous care. When the offensive launched on August 9, 1945, Soviet armored columns plunged into the mountains and emerged on the far side with shocking speed. One tank crewman later described the surreal experience. "We drove for days without stopping, the desert heat shimmering on our armor, and the Japanese hadn't even mined the passes." In some sectors, Soviet units covered up to 150 kilometers in a single day. The advance through terrain the Japanese expected would take weeks happened in days. By the time Japanese commanders grasped that the Soviets had crossed the mountains, Soviet spearheads were already seizing critical cities and rail junctions deep inside Manchuria. The three-front coordination was unprecedented. All three fronts attacked on August 9th, creating impossible dilemmas for Japanese commanders. Defend everywhere and be strong nowhere. Concentrate against one thrust and be encircled by the others. Japanese defensive doctrine, built around static lines and frontal resistance, simply had no answer to simultaneous penetration on multiple axes. Soviet tank commanders who'd fought through Poland, Ukraine, and Germany reported with astonishment how readily Japanese positions disintegrated. Major General Vasily Ryazanov of the 5th Guards Tank Army observed that Japanese positions melted away before our tanks, unlike the tenacious resistance of the Germans. Veterans described the campaign as a stroll compared to the hell of Berlin and Stalingrad. The contrast was unmistakable. German defenders had contested every meter, counter-attacking with panzers and panzerfausts, converting cities into fortresses. Japanese defenders, lacking mobile reserves and modern, anti-tank weapons, could only watch helplessly as Soviet armor bypassed their bunkers and drove into their rear areas. What unfolded when these two military philosophies collided was less a battle than a systematic disintegration. In modern warfare, armies don't merely lose battles, they lose the capacity to fight at all. At midnight on August 9, 1945, Soviet forces struck simultaneously across 3 fronts. The Japanese had received intelligence suggesting a Soviet buildup, but they'd achieved no meaningful preparation. Within hours, Japanese defenses were disintegrating. The velocity of collapse stunned even Soviet commanders. Japanese static defensive positions, engineered to repel World War I-style frontal assaults, were simply bypassed. Soviet operational maneuver groups identified vulnerabilities, punched through, and raced into the rear. Japanese strongpoints found themselves isolated, encircled, and irrelevant. Communications collapsed almost instantly. Japanese commanders lost contact with forward units and possessed no reserves to seal breaches. Lieutenant Colonel Saburo Hayashi of the Kwantung Army captured the chaos in his memoir. It was as if a thunderbolt had struck. We had no time to organize, no reserves to plug the breaches. Soviet tanks materialized everywhere, and our communications collapsed. The experience was disorienting and terrifying. Units preparing for frontal defense suddenly discovered Soviet armor behind them. Officers attempting to coordinate responses found telephone lines dead and messengers vanished. The fog of war became absolute. The Transbaikal fronts thrust through the Greater Khingan Mountains turned the entire Japanese defensive concept inside out. Japanese planners had assumed the mountains would funnel any Soviet offensive into predictable corridors where defenses could concentrate. Instead, Soviet forces crossed on multiple axes and emerged deep in the Japanese rear. By the time Japanese commanders understood the situation, Soviet spearheads were already seizing Mukden, Changchun, and Harbin. Meretschkov's First Far Eastern Front with 586,000 troops began driving toward the coast and the ultimate symbolic objective, Port Arthur. The fortress that had embodied Russian humiliation in 1905 was now within reach. Soviet forces advanced with ruthless precision, brushing aside scattered Japanese resistance. The Japanese possessed no doctrine for responding to deep penetration. Their plans assumed a defensive battle along prepared lines, falling back to secondary positions if necessary. Intensity, medium. But there was no falling back. Soviet forces were already behind them. Attempted withdrawals became routes. Units trying to establish new defensive lines found Soviet tanks arriving before they could entrench. The tempo of operations exceeded anything Japanese officers had ever encountered, but the opening breakthrough was merely the beginning. What followed was a pursuit unlike anything witnessed in the Pacific War. Some military campaigns are remembered for their savagery. This one is remembered for its asymmetry. From August 9th to August 20th, 1945, the Soviet war machine achieved one of the most lopsided victories in modern military history. The final casualty figures expose the campaign's devastating nature. Soviet losses totaled approximately 12,031 killed, wounded, and missing, including only about 2,300 killed. Japanese losses exceeded 80,000 dead, with estimates of around 15,000 wounded and between 594,000 and 650,000 captured. The kill ratio approached 30-1. Soviet forces advanced faster than in any European operation. Territorial gains were measured not in kilometers, but in hundreds of kilometers. In some sectors, Soviet spearheads covered up to 800 kilometers over the 11-day campaign, averaging between 40 and 70 kilometers daily. This tempo exceeded even the most successful Soviet operations against Germany. The pace of advance maintained operational coherence despite the immense distances. Soviet logistics, perfected through years of continental warfare, kept fuel, ammunition, and supplies flowing to advancing spearheads. Tank columns that covered 150 kilometers in a day still had fuel and ammunition when they reached their objectives. The mechanization that had crushed the Wehrmacht now crushed the Kwantung Army with even greater ease. Soviet tank commanders noted the stark contrast with their European experience. One officer wrote, "Japanese positions melted away before our tanks, unlike the tenacious resistance of the Germans." Another described the campaign as a walk compared to the hell of Berlin and Stalingrad. The difference wasn't courage. Japanese soldiers fought when they could, but they lacked the weapons, doctrine, and support to mount effective resistance against deep battle tactics. The collapse prevented any organized Japanese withdrawal or establishment of secondary defensive lines. Units attempting retreat found Soviet forces already blocking their path. Strongpoints that held out found themselves surrounded and bypassed by the main Soviet advance. Retreat became rout, and rout became mass surrender. Key milestones marked the campaign's progression. By August 11th through the 14th, Soviet spearheads had crossed the Greater Khingan Mountains and seized vital rail junctions. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast. Organized Japanese resistance collapsed almost immediately. Soldiers who'd been fighting hours earlier laid down their weapons. Officers committed suicide rather than face the dishonor of capitulation. By August 18th through the 20th, Soviet forces had captured Mukden, Changchun, Harbin, and Port Arthur. The Kwantung Army, once the pride of Japanese militarism, ceased to exist as a fighting force. The human experience of the collapse was chaotic and brutal. Japanese soldiers described the terror of confronting an enemy that materialized everywhere simultaneously. Soviet armor emerged from unexpected directions, guns blazing. Air attacks were constant. There was no safe rear area. Communications were severed. Officers possessed no information and received no orders. Men surrendered in groups of hundreds, then thousands. Some units fought to the last man. Others simply dissolved. Civilians caught in the Soviet advance faced violence, looting, and reprisals. The collapse of military order meant the collapse of all order. As Japanese armies disintegrated across Manchuria, the campaign's impact was being felt in a location far more consequential than any battlefield, the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. History remembers August of 1945 for 2 atomic bombs, but Japanese leaders were equally terrified by what was happening in Manchuria. On August 6th, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, killing tens of thousands instantly. On August 9th, a second bomb destroyed Nagasaki. That same day, the Soviet Union launched Operation August Storm. For Japan's leadership, this combination created a crisis that shattered any remaining hope of avoiding unconditional surrender. Imperial Conference minutes from August 9th and 10th reveal the panic the Soviet invasion generated among senior officials. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo and Army Chief Yoshijiro Umezu both cited Soviet entry as destroying any hope for mediation or continued resistance. Japan's strategy for ending the war had depended on the Soviet Union. Despite ideological enmity, Stalin had maintained a neutrality pact with Japan. Japanese diplomats had been pursuing Soviet mediation for a negotiated peace that would allow Japan to avoid unconditional surrender and preserve the imperial system. The Soviet invasion annihilated that strategy in a single night. There would be no mediation. There would be no negotiated peace. Japan now confronted a two-front war it couldn't possibly survive. American forces were preparing to invade the home islands from the south. Soviet forces were destroying Japanese armies in Manchuria and would soon threaten Korea and the home islands from the north. The strategic situation was hopeless. Historian Tsuyoshi Hasegawa and others argue the Soviet invasion was the decisive factor compelling Japan's surrender. The atomic bombs were devastating, but Japan had already endured months of conventional firebombing that killed more people than the nuclear weapons. Japanese cities were burning, the civilian population was starving, yet military leadership had continued to resist, preparing for a final defense of the home islands that would have cost millions of lives. The Soviet invasion transformed the calculation. It exposed Japanese mainland armies to immediate and total annihilation. The speed of the Soviet advance meant every hour of delay resulted in tens of thousands more troops lost and hundreds more kilometers of territory seized. The pressure was unbearable. If Japan didn't surrender immediately, there would be nothing left to surrender. The combination of atomic bombs and Soviet invasion within 48 hours created a dual crisis that overwhelmed Japanese decision-making. The Supreme War Council, deadlocked between factions favoring surrender and those demanding a final battle, finally broke. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast. He cited a new and most cruel bomb, but also referenced the changing military situation. The Soviet invasion was implicit in those words. Yet for the Soviets, the campaign's strategic impact remained secondary to its symbolic meaning, the final settling of accounts. Military victories fade from memory, but the reversal of national humiliation becomes legend. Soviet forces deliberately raised the red banner over Port Arthur Fortress on August 22, 1945. Marshal Vasilevsky ensured this symbolic location received priority attention despite its limited military value. The fortress, whose fall in 1905 had symbolized Russian disgrace, now witnessed Russian triumph. The moment was immortalized in photographs and newsreels. Soviet propaganda made it the emotional centerpiece of victory celebrations. Official Soviet communiques and propaganda explicitly referenced settling accounts for 1905 and avenging Tsushima. The revenge narrative wasn't subtext, it was the text. Soviet newspapers blazed with headlines celebrating the reversal of 1905. Radio broadcasts reminded listeners of Tsushima and Mukden. Military orders of the day invoked the memory of Russian sailors who'd perished 40 years before. The campaign was framed as the redemption of national honor. The recapture of Port Arthur was saturated with symbolism. In 1905, Japanese forces had besieged the fortress for months, finally capturing it after savage fighting. Russian defenders had fought courageously, but were doomed by incompetent leadership and inadequate support. The fall of Port Arthur had marked the beginning of the end for Russian hopes in that war. Now, in 1945, Soviet forces recaptured the fortress effortlessly. There was no siege. There was barely any combat. Japanese defenders surrendered or fled. The contrast couldn't have been more complete. Soviet military leadership connected the 1945 victory directly to the redemption of Russian national honor. Vasilevsky and other commanders delivered speeches invoking the humiliations of 1905 and the triumph of 1945. The message was unmistakable. The Soviet Union had avenged the Tsarist defeat. The shame of Tsushima was erased. Russia was no longer the sick man of Asia, but a superpower. The campaign demonstrated Soviet military supremacy in Asia and established the USSR as a Pacific power. In 1905, Russia had been defeated by an Asian nation. In 1945, the Soviet Union annihilated that same nation's army in 11 days. The reversal was total. The kill ratio of 30-1, the speed of advance, and the overwhelming technological and tactical superiority all served to erase the memory of 1905 from Russian consciousness. The symbolism extended beyond Port Arthur. Soviet forces recaptured every piece of territory lost in 1905. Southern Sakhalin, ceded to Japan in the Treaty of Portsmouth, was retaken. The Kuril Islands, promised to Stalin at Yalta, were occupied. Soviet influence in Manchuria, lost in 1905, was restored. The geopolitical order of Northeast Asia was rewritten in 11 days. Yet for hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers, the campaign's end marked not liberation, but the beginning of a different nightmare. The 11-day war was over, but for hundreds of thousands, the suffering had only begun. Between 594,000 and 650,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians were taken prisoner by Soviet forces during and after Operation August Storm. This mass captivity represented one of the largest forced labor operations in modern history. The prisoners were transported to labor camps scattered across Siberia and the Soviet Far East, where they toiled in mines, forests, and construction projects under brutal conditions. The experience of Japanese prisoners of war in Soviet camps became a traumatic chapter in Japanese collective memory. Tens of thousands died from disease, malnutrition, exhaustion, and cold. Survival rates were estimated at 80 to 85%, meaning between 90,000 and 130,000 prisoners perished in captivity. Those who survived endured years of forced labor in some of the harshest environments on Earth. Many prisoners weren't repatriated until 1956, 11 years after the war's end. The delay was deliberate. Stalin exploited the prisoners as a labor resource and as leverage in post-war negotiations with Japan. Families in Japan received no information about whether their loved ones were alive or dead. Men who'd expected to return home after Japan's surrender found themselves trapped in a frozen hell with no end in sight. The POW experience represented the complete reversal of 1905. In that earlier war, Russian prisoners had suffered in Japanese camps. Now Japanese soldiers endured the same fate in Soviet hands. The cycle of vengeance was complete, but the human cost extended far beyond the battlefield. The mass captivity also served Soviet strategic interests. Labor extracted from Japanese prisoners contributed to Soviet reconstruction after the devastation of World War II. Prisoners built infrastructure, mined coal and minerals, and logged timber in regions where Soviet workers were scarce. The economic value of forced labor was substantial. For Japan, the POW issue poisoned relations with the Soviet Union for decades. The slow return of prisoners, the absence of information, and the deaths in captivity created enduring bitterness. Even today, the fate of Japanese prisoners in Siberia remains a sensitive topic in Japanese historical memory. Operation August Storm thus became a campaign of multiple meanings: military revolution, historical vengeance, strategic earthquake, and human tragedy, all compressed into 11 days that altered the course of World War II and settled a 40-year debt. Operation August Storm answered the historical question definitively. It was simultaneously the Soviet Union's calculated revenge for 1905's humiliation and a devastating demonstration that modern deep battle doctrine could annihilate an army still fighting the previous war. Intensity high. In 11 days, the Soviets achieved a kill ratio approaching 30 to 1. They advanced faster than in any European campaign, covering up to 800 kilometers and averaging 40 to 70 kilometers daily. They deployed 1.66 million troops, 5,500 tanks, and 3,700 aircraft against a hollowed-out Japanese force that existed more on paper than in reality. The result wasn't a battle, it was systematic disintegration. The campaign may have been as decisive as the atomic weapons in compelling Japan's surrender. Japanese Imperial Conference minutes reveal that top leaders cited the Soviet invasion as destroying their final hope for mediated peace. The combination of atomic bombs and Soviet invasion within 48 hours created a crisis that broke the deadlock in Tokyo and compelled Emperor Hirohito to announce surrender on August 15th. The revenge narrative was explicit and deliberate. Soviet commanders and propaganda invoked settling accounts for 1905. The red banner raised over Port Arthur Fortress symbolized the reversal of Tsushima. Every piece of territory lost in 1905 was recaptured. The geopolitical humiliation was erased through overwhelming military superiority. But the campaign also proved a broader truth about modern warfare. The gap between doctrines matters more than the gap between courage. Japanese soldiers fought when they could, but they were imprisoned in World War I defensive concepts facing an enemy that had mastered World War II operational art. Static defenses were bypassed. Linear thinking was shattered by simultaneous multi-axis attacks. Courage couldn't overcome obsolete equipment, inadequate training, and a doctrine designed for a war that no longer existed. The Soviet deep battle tactics employed in Manchuria represented the culmination of 4 years of brutal learning on the Eastern Front. operational maneuver groups penetrated hundreds of kilometers, bypassing strongpoints and encircling entire formations. The tempo of operations prevented any organized response. The coordination of 3 fronts attacking simultaneously created impossible dilemmas for Japanese commanders. The result was a form of warfare that rendered traditional defensive concepts obsolete. The human cost extended far beyond the battlefield. The mass captivity of up to 650,000 Japanese prisoners and their deportation to Siberian labor camps created a humanitarian catastrophe lasting more than a decade. Tens of thousands died in captivity. Those who survived carried the trauma for the rest of their lives. The POW experience became a bitter coda to the military catastrophe. The legacy of Operation August Storm is complex. It demonstrated Soviet military prowess and established the USSR as a Pacific superpower. It may have been decisive in ending World War II. It settled a 40-year debt of national humiliation. But it also exposed the brutal logic of modern warfare, where technological and doctrinal superiority can transform battles into massacres, and where the human cost of victory and defeat extends far beyond the battlefield. The Red Banner over Port Arthur in 1945 didn't simply mark a military victory. It erased Tsushima from Russian memory and announced the arrival of a new superpower in Asia, born from the ashes of 1905's defeat. The Kwantung Army, once the terror of Asia, was erased in 11 days. And the world learned that some historical debts are paid not through diplomacy, but through the complete destruction of armies. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.